Hey, I am Ceres, and this is Human Path to Sovereignty. I believe that deeply embracing your humanness is the path to true prosperity, not just success, and alignment. I have a sacred contract to share this content that doesn't exist about sovereignty. Today, I want to share the most remarkable day of my life. I've had many impactful spiritual experiences throughout my journey, like perhaps many of you watching this. But this is definitely the biggest. Now, this story is also really key if you want to follow my mission and you want to be part of Sovereign Community. You may want to read my book when it comes out. Highly recommend it. But first, before I tell the story, this channel is about sovereignty. It's about sovereign relationships, how to connect. And I want to challenge you a bit, especially if you are someone that is in conscious community or spiritual community. I want to challenge you that when you take in my story, I don't want you to make assumptions, because this is what happens. In communities like this, people share a really big experience and the other person says, oh my God, me too, me too, me too. And this me too doesn't create space for people to actually be deeply seen. And it's important. I want you to have that space, to be really have the space and the openness and the curiosity to get your experience without assuming that your experience is like mine or my experience is like yours. And it's also quite vulnerable when we share these things with others. And if someone kind of just says, oh yeah, I just had that experience last week, it can feel kind of dismissive. And it just can feel really bad when our soul just wants to be witnessed. So I'm going to do the best I can to sharing this experience with words, although, words can be limiting. But last February, I was in Minnesota unexpectedly. I'll tell you that story in a separate video. But I asked a friend to do a sound healing on me while I was there, and we hadn't seen each other for a while. And she said, I actually just recently had a dream about you. You were naked and you were covered in blood, and I didn't really know what it meant at first, but I sensed later that you were having a rebirth. Now, at that point, up until that point, I wouldn't have used the word rebirth, but when she said it, I was like, oh, yeah, I think I am having a rebirth. So a few days later, I found myself at my parents' house. They had just gotten back from Florida. I called them up. Hey, can I go home with you guys for a while? And they said, sure, of course. And I had just bought the book, Sacred Contracts by Carolyn Myss. I had got the message I needed to buy it, but then I went to a thrift store and it just lit up on the shelf. So I was like, I got to read this. So when I got to my parents' place, I sat on the couch and I started reading, mostly to myself. I had my headphones on, and then I started reading out loud. And when I was reading out loud, my parents were kind of coming back for a trip, putting things away. They were listening to the stories I was sharing about Jesus, Muhammad, Abraham, Buddha, Ram Dass, and then others that, we've never heard of. All interesting. So at one point, I just took off my headphones and I started reading out loud to my parents, and we started kind of discussing the idea of fulfilling a sacred contract. Now, I had been really curious about contracts recently. I had been very confused about how much choice I have versus my higher self. And I had kind of already understood that I had made some additional midlife contracts that was related to a bigger contract before I was born, but it was still kind of unclear. At this point, I knew that I was writing a book on sovereignty, and I knew that this book was going to be significant, and that's what I knew. So when I'm reading through this book, I found it really fascinating. The author really emphasizes the humanness of great prophets, an aspect that's often overlooked in traditional narratives. And she highlights how these figures, when fulfilling their purpose, often didn't know until later in life and didn't initially realize their spiritual mission, reflecting on that idea that upon entering the world that we forget. The forgetting is portrayed as a crucial part of the journey of not really remembering what we agreed to. So I got to page 106, felt accomplished, and then I went to bed. The next day, I had planned on doing a mushroom ceremony. This is something that I do for my own. So the next day, I had planned on doing a mushroom ceremony. I do mushroom ceremonies by myself as part of my spiritual practices. And I prepped the space as I always do, although I had never done it in my parents' home before. And I took them, surrendered. Obviously I'm a very intentional person, but I didn't know what was going to happen. So the first thing I felt was just the joy of having a brother to grow up with in the same house, having these shared experiences, right? It's like your parents like create this weird little world, and then you and your sibling or siblings get to kind of have a similar experience, although both me and him are quite different. So just feeling into that joy, and then that kind of moved into disappointment and grief, because especially at that time, I'd been feeling quite disconnected from my brother. And I wept until I turned over into this deeper experience of vulnerability. You know, because I live in Mexico, so I would often stay with my brother's family or other people, but staying in the home with my brother and his family is a very intimate experience, you know, and I felt into that dance of intimacy, or sometimes a lack thereof, you know, because I also had been staying with two of my friends during this trip. And it felt really it felt important that I stayed with these friends. And in this moment, it was like, oh yeah, this was important for me to do the dance of intimacy, or lack of dance in one of the relationships. We weren't talking about the boundaries or the things enough. It's like that dance is the communication, the boundaries, that just the intertwining of the differences of how we live, right? When you stay in someone's home, there is more of an obvious difference of the way that we move through the world, and just the simple things. And I heard this voice. Yes, you have been more intimate in your life. You've been more intimate with people. You've learned that. But now you need to show up on a deeper level of intimacy. Your purpose is to be intimate with humanity. I was like, oh, shoot. Okay, that's a big thing, to be intimate with humanity. And so it's like I've done a lot of work, but there was still a lot of work to do to be able to just show up more fluidly with intimacy with all. And I could just feel like pieces of my resistance to the intimacy. And then my Enneagram type pieces of it were starting to integrate within my being. It was like my humanness was like being squeezed out of me. And I sat up and I grabbed my electrolytes, and I just watched my hand move in slow motion. It was like, oh, this isn't a human grabbing this drink. This is like a purely divine being. I felt the power and the intention of my movements. And I kind of like stretched my neck back and forth. And I was like, I'm having a rebirth. I'm not sure I'd ever used that term before, and people can put different meanings on it, right? Whatever it was, awakening, rebirth, whatever it was, it felt like new territory. It felt like a completely new experience. Now, I have had many experiences where I did not feel my human self, what many call ego deaths. I personally don't use that phrase, but I've had many experiences like that where I didn't feel my human self. I felt the oneness, felt divine, all the things. But this was different. This was different from my past experiences of dissolving my humanness. And as I set up, I noticed that the music stopped, and we had been playing some angelic music. So the house went silent, and I walked over to the corner of the room where I had put the water carafe. I don't know why I put it there. That's just where I put it. And I went to go fill up my water, and I knelt down in front of this water at the wall, and my head just started bouncing back and forth. I was full stimming mode, autistic stimming mode, where I was like going around in patterns, and I was just seeing my entire life. I was seeing how everything in my life had prepared me for this. I could see that everything that had happened to me in the last few years were like alter preparing me. I was like weaving patterns and integrating what I was being shown. You know, sometimes in psychedelic experiences, things can happen quite quickly. There's a lot happening, a lot digesting, relationships, all sorts of things. Everything was preparing me. I could see how I was designed perfectly to fulfill this contract. Every part of my astrology, my Enneagram, gene keys was part of my design for me to fulfill this contract. I could see how I chose my parents. And yes, intellectually, I've understood this concept. And yes, I've understood that there's lessons and challenges and things that I've gotten from them being my parents, but I've never had the perception of just like knowing in all of my being that, oh, I chose them. Because I looked at them and I was like, oh, they're going to help challenge me in the way that I need in order to prepare me to fulfill this. I could even see how they have contracts with me. And everything that happened before this was more or less preparing me. And I could see how that when things kind of didn't work out, it was because I had like outgrown my life, right? And the universe was trying to keep up with me. But I kept choosing my mission. So I kept outgrowing things. I meant to show people how to deeply be with themselves and others, to share how to create true prosperity, not just success, which many humans have clearly figured out, to share how to create sovereign relationships and sovereign community, and to show people sovereignty by sharing my story, my very vulnerable story. I could feel the energy of people when they read my book. It was this deep well of intimacy where they could see themselves more clearly through me sharing my own intimacy. By like inviting them into my intimacy, they were able to be with their own intimacy, which to me is a big part of sovereignty. Because I kept choosing my sacred contract, I could not have been married or had kids before this. Like one thing that I never felt like I've ever sabotaged relationships. And I have met soulmates, and they just, they were aligned with where I was at, but not where I was heading. So the men before me could have not walked this path that I'm heading. And I had already understood this to some degree, but this was just showing up more clearly related to everything else. And I suddenly felt this opening in my energy, and I felt this deep intimacy with the divine as I arched my back and flipped my head up, and I just whispered, "I'm sorry." Because I had been in spiritual crisis and confusion and cursing out my guides and God and just like, what is my life? And it makes sense because I read in the Sacred Contracts book that that's all part of fulfilling a contract. But I felt this intimacy penetrate my soul in this like explosion of pleasure. And just words can't do it justice, but it was just like the most holy thing I've ever experienced, just rushing through me. And I put my hands back on the floor, and I began having contractions like I was giving birth, because I was giving birth. I went into labor with this like strike of light coming through me, the divine just running through me in a way I had never experienced. And I was giving birth to this new energy on the planet. And this is something I do a lot with energetic work, is birthing, because I'm a mother goddess. This is part of the way I move energy, but never like this. This is the most profound birth I have ever done. I moaned and I cried, and I asked my mom to come beside me. So I was giving birth to a new way of being in the world, a sovereign way of being with each other. And I could hear my dad nervously pacing back and forth upstairs as he heard my moans and groans. And my mom later said what it sounded like. So I imagine my dad was like super uncomfortable. I told him before, if you hear strange sounds, just don't come downstairs. So my mom was there next to me, and I just feel like I needed her in that moment. This is a significant moment in my life where I'm having this rebirth, and all the work that I had done with her and the mother wound in the last year was needed for her to really open enough to support me in this process. And I just looked up at my mom. My mom gave me the name Janelle, and I looked up at her. And I just said, "I am Ceres, and I am here to teach people how to be with themselves and others." I said many other things. I'm not going to quote everything I said, but it was like I was feeling this rush of the divine flow through me, and it was the most incredible experience of my life. And tears were just streaming down my face as I was in awe of the beauty. I was also like stimming quite a bit, autistically stimming, but I was also crying, and I felt so humble and so grateful that I hadn't given up. And everything that I had been through also made a lot more sense. And I just felt such a heart opening. And I just said to my mom, I said, "Isn't it beautiful, Mom?" And she said, "I can hear it in your voice." And I said, "I needed you to be here with me." And I just can't tell you how special it was to have my mom by my side for this experience. And I mean, the stars aligned so that could happen for sure. And yeah, when my mom saw me in the corner of the room, she had realized that she had drawn a picture of me about 5 years ago. And she didn't really know what she drew. It was like, was this a child? It's like standing. But I was in the corner, and I had this like hood on, kneeling. And that's what she drew. And she is like, when I saw you, I realized that's what I drew. And she had just kind of kept it in one of her books as a bookmark, but like something clicked for her too. And she was also like guided to protect me during that time and to not see me as her daughter, but seeing me as someone that needed protecting, which makes total sense when you're birthing new energy on the planet. It's not something that happens every day. Need a little bit of protection for it. I needed someone else to be there with me. So I felt like a new mom afterwards, total endorphin release. I was a proud mama, like of energy, of possibility, of connection, of community, something that I had never seen and I had never experienced on this planet. And I'd searched for it. And I was just like this puddle of joy and excitement afterwards of like, this is amazing. And I had been using the name Ceres. So I was born Janelle, using the name Ceres for magic work for about 8 years. So anytime I did a ritual, I used the name Ceres, which when you're doing rituals daily, that's a lot. I was very familiar with the name. So Ceres is a Roman mother goddess. And it took me some years to fully embrace it as my path, but I've had to in the last, especially 4 years, embrace myself as a mother goddess in this world. And, in this experience, I was fully channeling myself as Ceres. And I knew that I needed to be Janelle to prepare myself to be Ceres, to fulfill this contract. So after that, I did not feel like Janelle anymore. And I knew I had to use the name Ceres from that moment on. And I always liked my name before. I never planned on changing it, yet suddenly it just wasn't my name. I mean, a part of me will always be Janelle, but it took me about 3 months before I actually announced it and started telling people my name was Ceres. I had a lot to process, so not just with the name, but just like everything. I'll make a separate video about my name change at some point, but a week after this experience, I flew back to Playa del Carmen, arrived in my apartment, and there was this moth directly in my bed, in the middle of my bed. And moths represent metamorphosis, death, endings, transformation, enlightenment, and facing shadows. And I was just so grateful for this little moth message and support. And I actually put it on my altar for the next couple weeks. I knew I had a lot of work to do at this point. I had no idea how much, but it was way more than I even could comprehend at that time. But I knew that what I experienced during that rebirth was the energy that I needed to live my life. So after about a week after, it took many days, but I started to get all the human stuff back. It did not just pop back right after the experience. About a week later, I was back in it. And it was like, okay, I know that I need to get to that point to fulfill this contract, but I have a lot of my ego strategies and patterns to integrate. And I knew that I had to do it to fulfill this contract. So I just had the most magical, beautiful, empowering experience. And then now I'm just back to human contraction, limitations. And I crashed. I mean, I was different. I had already had a lot of transformation from other intense things that had happened in the last year, but I crashed and it was painful and it was confusing. And it was like, oh, I'm going to have to integrate all these parts on my own so that I can write about it. So I can write about, there's a difference between doing personal growth work from sovereignty and not from sovereignty. And this is part of what I'm including in my book. And then anyone could do it. They read about it. And the next few months after the experience, I also watched a lot of near-death experience stories. Even though I didn't have a near-death experience, there were aspects that felt really similar. There's an energy of the way they spoke that felt really comforting to me as I processed what just happened and what my life was moving forward. So the path ahead did not look easy. I was meant to be a vulnerable leader who's always showing themselves fully to the world, being vulnerable with humanity, as I was told. Now, that's not how most leaders show up. And I was shown that I was part of a new wave of leadership that looks very different than we've seen in the past. People like their leaders to be looking like they're in control, a little bit guarded. There's a way that we expect that feels safe to most people. So I'm sitting here with this really clear vision of my path moving forward, right? Openly speaking about something very controversial, which I haven't shared yet. demonstrate vulnerability as a leader, my humanness, and I needed to find facilitators to run my programs, effectively, facilitators that could embrace their humanness. And not everyone wants to do that. And obviously write books and speak. And at my age, you guys, I just kind of want to hide in the background and enjoy my time with my loved ones, not put myself out there, right? At one point in my life, I would have jumped on it. And where I'm at now, I just want a simple life. I kind of don't want to put myself out there in the most vulnerable way possible. And yet that's probably why this is the time for me to fulfill this contract, because if I would have done it before, there would have been more shadowy motivations, like needing validation or needing attention. And I don't have that need anymore. I feel like I've integrated those parts of me. I don't want to put myself out there just to put myself out there. I'm doing this because I care about this cause. And I would much rather be hiding, honestly. And it just also feels like a really big responsibility. And I've been really scared of effing it up. And if I'm being totally honest, there's still fear around effing it up, but like less than there was before. But I've grappled with my path forward, and I never considered not doing it, but I did have to get to a fuller yes. Like I had to digest a little bit of the divisions I was seeing. And this video is only sharing one part of my journey, although significant, but I have felt like I've been in a video game the past couple of years to experience certain things and write about them. And there's so many times where I was screaming like, take me out of this video game, this effing video game. I don't want to be a lab rat anymore. And it was like my entire path wasn't totally clear. I was just kind of getting some breadcrumbs. The fullest expression of this mission, as far as the books go, are writing 3 books. And 2 of the books will be coming out soon, and one of them a bit later. And I'm a yes to it. I have a choice. I mean, I could just write one, but I wanna do it. I want to do it. I want to be a full yes. And I do have another book that I have written already. And that book was more as like initiating me as an author. So that way, when I got this point in my journey, I'm not like, I don't know how to write a book or publish it. I've already done all of it. So it's easy. I'll put a link in if anyone wants to pick up my first book. And obviously, if you are curious about my book, please sign up to be on the email list to be the first to know when it comes out. There shouldn't be anything else out there like it from what I have gone through and what I'm being told. I don't think anything close to it exists. Thank you so much for creating that openness and curiosity just to take in my experience. And I want you to remember that too. Maybe you can even ask for that if you're sharing something really vulnerable, or you can remember it if someone else is sharing a really impactful, important story for them as well. So thanks for being on this journey with me. And obviously, if you're vibing and you want more, please subscribe and like, and please send to any friends that you think might be interested in this channel. It's all about sovereign relationships, sovereign connection, having more integrity as we show up as coaches and healers, as well as really understanding what true prosperity is, not just success. So please embrace your humanness and the humanness of others. I will see you next time.